So I did it about it. But
That wasn't
now
the
you're,
best.
now you're at
Not
properly
official.
But it would be nice if Rachel was loving it.
also
And it's only an hour, 6 to 7, so you can still have your wild nightlife. Go out and tell what it's like. I know it's true. I'm well aware of your social schedule.
I was working in documentary television. See?
Just somebody, they could fly, clearly that's
No, non la tira chi via, non sono una roba.
Downstairs.
And then redid it from top to bottom. That was my experience in network television. Made me realize that when the LSE program started,
well, it's not all. It's not particularly bad, fortunate.
I knew Peter.
Yeah.
He ended up doing it.
Yeah, no, he's not. Heart attack. Stress. He had hypertension. He had a very complicated life. He had a white mother's life. I didn't hear yeah, and then it turned out that the father, yeah, was all very weird. He got terrorist and dead about no, it was all.
Well, yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome. I'm Steve Coll. I'm the new dean of the Columbia Journalism School and Nick's successor, and I'm just here to welcome you. Unlike your program notes, Nick will be moderating this afternoon's discussion, but I did want to launch us just by, first of all, thanking you for being here. Great turnout, quite a lot of our faculty and other friends from journalism education here and abroad to launch this very important piece of work that I know Nick worked very hard on, as did Jean and John, over a period of many weeks, which we launched formally today, Educating Journalists, a New Plea for the University Tradition. I'll let the discussion unfold and let Nick and his co-authors introduce it as they wish, but as a reader of the report, it just made me that much more grateful for the fierce devotion that Nick showed in his 10 years as he redirected the journalism school toward the university tradition and toward a balanced relationship with both the profession and Columbia. And it's one of the great gifts of this inheritance of mine that he did this so deliberately over such a long period of time. And I think quite a lot of the ideas that he worked on and that others have worked on are encapsulated in this report. So this is a discussion I imagine is going to be around for the next 30 or 40 years, but it's a pretty good inflection point, and I really look forward to the panel. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Steve. And let me start just by telling a little bit about where this report came from, and then I'll pass it along to my colleagues. In 2005, there was a sort of grand announcement, as these things go, at the Carnegie Corporation office in Midtown Manhattan of something called the Carnegie Knight Journalism Initiative. One of the key players in setting it up was Susan King, who has gone to the dark side and become a dean. But she was then running this program at Carnegie. So at that time, the heads of these two foundations were Vartan Gregorian at Carnegie, who's still president of Carnegie, and Haden Carter at Knight, who is no longer president of Knight, having been succeeded after just a short time by Alberto Ibargüen. Michael Maness of Knight is here with us tonight, by the way, so welcome. We launched this initiative. We had 12 schools in it. The initiative is one of a series of efforts, some of which are discussed herein, that have been going on for 100 years to sort of do something about journalism education. Whether that's a necessary cause or not, we'll get to later. But there have been reports and initiatives and so on about journalism education pretty continuously for the whole time there's been journalism education. And there have been characteristic arguments along the way, as we'll discuss. So we did many things, which I won't go into detail about now, in the Carnegie Knight Initiative. We went through 2 3-year grant cycles. We got to the end. And somewhere near the end, I went to Susan and said, what we don't have is a kind of document that has, if not a Carnegie Knight educational vision, at least somebody's educational vision in one place for what journalism education should be. So Susan essentially said, okay, I'll write you a check, and you produce it. The only proviso was that I had to go down to the Flatiron District and find the most cutting-edge digital journalists I could find to be my co-authors. So that explains the other people sitting up here with me. No, that's not the case. But the first 3 of us are recently minted ex-journalism deans. And as such, I was dean here for 10 years. Jean was dean at University of North Carolina for 5 years. Jack was founding dean at LSU for 18 years, is that right? And then became provost, one of the few journalism deans ever to go to a higher position in a university. But because we were all former, we all had a little bit of time on our hands. So we used that time in varying proportions to do research on this report. The report is triple bylined, so anything that we disagreed about, officially we agree about everything in the report, and anything that we disagreed about in the production is strictly behind the scenes, but it does not represent the views of the Carnegie Corporation, the Knight Foundation, or any of the Carnegie Knight schools. It just represents us. The only other thing I'll say is that we chose to focus a lot on graduate education in journalism, which is the entirety, almost the entirety of what goes on at this school, but is a very small part of what goes on in journalism education generally, and we'll go into some of the reasons for that. So our format will be each of my two co-authors will present some of what's in the report or reflect on some of what's in the report, which you have and is available online as a PDF. Then I'll say a few words. Then Charlie Beckett, who's come and joined us from London, is going to give a sort of official response. Then we'll go interactive with the audience for our remaining time and may call on a couple people specifically. And we'll end at 6:15. The people who do these events at this school all come from the world of television journalism, which I do not come from, and that explains how we move on a very brisk schedule, and also it explains why we're sitting in these bar stools, which is deemed to be good for visuals, although it's not that comfortable. So apologies for that. So Jean, take it away, please.
Okay. I'd like to recognize a couple of people first. There are two people in the audience who really did a lot of work for me, and they were graduate students at the University of North Carolina while I was working on this report. And that's Lindsay Smithson-Stanley and Jennifer Harlow Farrar. Why don't you stand up? They were great. They did a lot of work. And they now know more about the history of journalism education than any other graduate student in the country, I think. American journalism education has always been anchored in a couple of traditions, one of them in the printing trades and another in the world of intellectuals and politicians who recognize the importance of journalists in the society. And in the early days of the nation, printers and editors were very actively participating in the rhetoric that shaped the American experiment. Journalism education was part of a professionalization movement that started in about the turn of the century, around 1900, although there were discussions about journalism education that took place as early as 1850, but really accelerated sort of in the 1870s. And they've reflected, the debates about journalism education have reflected strands of tension that inevitably arise when you are professionalizing, which was happening with engineering, social work, a variety of other fields. And the historical debate, I think, informs the current debate, and that's why the history is important. These questions have gone on for a long time, and they continue to be similar. Sometimes the wording is different. But initially, for example, the questions were these: do journalists need a college education, or are they tradesmen? And it was tradesmen. They didn't think about tradeswomen at that point. Are they professionals or craftsmen? Can journalism be taught in a classroom, or is the newsroom the best place to learn? Should the education be oriented toward students, getting jobs, or toward creating leaders for the future? Should journalists merely study liberal arts in college and then go to work and learn the trade? And should faculties be composed of research PhDs or professional journalists? Despite early encouragement by some professionals, as well as academics, to establish journalism at the graduate level, journalism education in the United States became almost universally an undergraduate endeavor. There are a few exceptions. It's been graduate at Columbia for most of Columbia's life. But in many, many schools, especially in the state, the public schools, it was overwhelmingly, and still is overwhelmingly, an undergraduate effort. Newspaper editors who were instrumental in the first decades of the 20th century in establishing journalism education were quite vocal about not being able to and not wanting to pay the salaries or wages they thought a master's degree would require. There was quite a bit of discussion at one point about a master's degree and its importance, but it always came down to a salary issue. So the questions continued for more years and in more venues than any of us want to consider. They get repeated often, and especially during times of challenge and change, which we all know we are in. So we hope with this report that we can enrich the debate and go forward and offer some new solutions rather than to repeat some of the tired mantras that seek to divide journalists and educators. Now, one question has pretty much been resolved, and that's that most everybody agrees now that journalists should have a college education. That doesn't seem to be too big of a debate anymore. But in the 1870s, some people argued that the best training was in the newsroom. And R.W. Bowker, who was the literary editor of the New York Evening Mail, captured the essence of those two traditions. And he said, some of the best men in this field have come direct from the composing case. The composing room abounds in common sense. But the man who is to help conduct, to have a share in molding public opinion through a great paper, needs the best and broadest education he can get. Bowker argued that a self-made man was more arrogant than the college man, because it puts modesty into a man to find that his new ideas were old 2,000 years ago, as he will find out from reading Plato, and to learn how much he cannot learn. And Bowker feared that those who didn't have an education would be too narrow to be good journalists. So in the report, we emphasize that graduate journalism education must be oriented toward the university and toward the profession. And the debate over whether academic or professional skills should take ascendancy is most often phrased in questions about faculty. Should faculty in journalism schools be PhDs with research, focus, and training, or should they be professional journalists? Most schools try to offer a combination. But to be truly oriented toward the university and toward the profession, faculty's alumni and current practicing professionals need to work together to combine their skills and expertise. Professionals and research faculty working together can improve the quality of the questions asked, the focus and the design of the research, and the understanding and usability of the findings. When I first started teaching, only a few years ago, editors and broadcast managers told me they wanted students who could hit the ground running. They aligned with Frederick Hudson, who was a 19th century managing editor of the New York Herald, and who said, the only place where one can learn to be a journalist is in a great newspaper office. Or with broadcasters in the late 1940s who wanted to survey the present courses and pretty well dictate what schools offered in terms of curriculum. What professionals wanted was to know how well a student could get a story on deadline. And rarely was an editor or a manager concerned with how well a student understood American history, culture, or politics. They didn't care whether students understood business models beyond the rudiments of selling advertising. And newspapers and broadcast stations were making money. College journalism programs focused on offering students courses in reporting, typography, photography, and editing. Requirements outside the journalism school were designed so that everybody would have a smattering of a little bit of everything. You have a couple courses in sociology, a couple courses in history, a couple courses in political science, so that you could ask questions of anyone and not sound too uninformed. But in recent years, editors started coming to me and saying, how can you help us? How do we understand what's happening to us? Do you know what's happening? Students ask questions like, how do we get jobs? How do we create our own jobs? So these times of challenge are perfect times for cooperation and advancement. Graduate schools of journalism have an opportunity to offer the knowledge base and the research skills that can help transform journalism. They are the one place that professionals and academics work together and intersect. Now, second major debate is focused on curriculum. And editors and broadcast managers have always complained about the quality of writing. You can go back to the 1870s, and the first complaint is that students don't know how to write. So they urged journalism schools to teach writing. And by 1996, we're still having this argument, but the Gannett Foundation, which then had transitioned to the Freedom Forum, shut down its 10-year-old innovative program in New York that brought professionals and academics together to further journalism research and education. That same year, it commissioned a report about journalism education titled Winds of Change, and it argued that faculty should be professionals. It decried reliance on the PhD, attacked theoretical courses, attacked academic research. And in the preface to the report, Charles Overby, who was then President and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum, argued that the standard for assessing journalism instruction should be simple: how much emphasis and how many resources are being allocated to teaching writing, reporting, editing, and the study of journalism, history, law, and ethics. At the graduate level, however, universities expect professional schools to do research, to advance the profession, to create leaders, and to lead and not follow the industries they're associated with. When you look carefully at the curriculum elements we emphasize in this report, you'll realize they align with the university mission. At the graduate level, we emphasize the importance not only of history and law, but also of research methods and theory. And with what today's journalists recognize is that elements of theory, understanding the audience, the impact of messages, are essential to the entrepreneurial journalism that we're all experimenting with. So let's turn just for a minute to what we've labeled in this report, guided practice. When Walter Williams designed Missouri School of Journalism in 1908, it was the first freestanding journalism school in the country, he emphasized that the school adds the laboratory to the lecture method, the clinic supplementing the classroom. It trains by doing. And in 1919, despite a very different beginning, Columbia School of Journalism actually dismissed students from classes for paid work in New York's newsrooms. As the world turned digital, many university programs were unprepared and were slow to change. Seasoned professionals also failed to recognize early signs of economic change and the dangers presented to traditional journalistic platforms. So in most cases, journalism schools had followed, not led the profession. But some educators did envision a different future. And in 1984, in an Oregon report, that was a very highly criticized report on journalism education, there was a quote in which one of the faculty members said, "The rapid infusion of new knowledge and the pace of technological change will push journalism mass communication schools away from industry-oriented sequence programs and toward more generic mass communication study." This report got a lot of pushback on that comment about generic mass communication study. The statement drew a lot of criticism from the press because journalists viewed it as a turn away from applied work and a turn to more theoretically based education. But we think now that perhaps more theoretically based education and more critical education would have prepared today's journalists to have better anticipated the massive changes in the journalism profession and in the media industries today. And we think that that's a role for graduate education. So as we turn away from industry-oriented sequences and toward more converged storytelling and practice, journalism schools are providing content to students and to communities in new ways. Today's question, how should journalists be taught the practical parts of journalism? We use the term guided practice. My own position is that journalism schools should teach students a variety of digital skills, but they also should teach them to anticipate future change. We as journalism educators should experiment with platforms and content and involve students in our practice and research. Schools, I don't think, should replace news providers, but rather they should offer incubators where practice and content can be tried, evaluated, and expanded. Schools are a place where there's room to fail. Businesses are usually not a place where there's room to fail. And through a combination of successes and failures, I think better journalism education and better practice can emerge.
Thanks. Jack?
Well, I want to thank Nick for inviting me to work on this report. As he pointed out, at the end of my time as an administrator at LSU, I was provost. I obviously knew what a journalism school, or thought I knew what a journalism school ought to be, so it wasn't as though I was sitting around every day wondering what I should look for in terms of quality. I spent a lot of time wondering what a lot of other units on campus ought to look like in terms of quality. So when I took on this project, one of the tasks was to try to look at journalism schools as if I hadn't been a dean at all, but as if I were just a provost. And how would I evaluate what a journalism program should look like? And this proved to be, for me, a very interesting, and I have to say, in some respects, disturbing undertaking. Because I recognized, as I went through the thought process, that actually journalism schools are extremely vulnerable, more so than I had actually really thought of before. And if you put that together with the circumstances we have today with journalism schools under siege in some key places around the country, I think we see that's going to be more and more the case. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quick takeaway points and then turn it over to our response, or turn it back to Nick. I think, first of all, what journalism schools, and particularly the people who head them, need to do is to be able to articulate a serious, compelling vision of what their school ought to do. There are a lot of ways to be a successful program of mass communication. There's not just one way, or a successful program of journalism. But I think, and I think our report reflects, that probably the best way to a secure future is to do something that journalism schools have not done well, and I think Gene gives you a good history to show what that is. On the one hand, we have not really integrated ourselves as well as we should into the academic mission of the university. A lot of people think that the academic mission of the university is inimical to what a good journalism program ought to be. I actually don't think that's true. But even if it were true, the only real choice if you don't do that is you ought to be a vocational school that gives out certificates. If you want to be part of the university, you have to be a serious intellectual undertaking. It's as simple as that. But having said that, there's another side to the story, and that is that in order to be a successful program that deserves to be a freestanding journalism program, you also have to have your feet firmly planted in journalism. And that means doing research and teaching that actually is relevant. Now, unfortunately, what happens a lot of times in the discipline of journalism and mass communication is that we've progressively gotten this idea that you're either one or the other. And as the university generally has become more self-referential, that is, writing things that only people like them read, whether you happen to be in mass communication or in the history department. Actually, the history department is a little better than some departments, but in many other departments. The problem is we're actually moving in the other direction. I'm going to say a little bit about that at the end of my comments. But I think that's the challenge, to be a serious academic enterprise and to be relevant. Now, that doesn't mean we go and tell every journalism professor, whatever they're doing today, that they need to immediately start doing practical research. Journalism schools can be very wide-ranging in what they do, and in fact, my view has always been that one of the great things about journalism schools is they can hire any kind of person they want. They can hire political scientists and sociologists. They can even hire a veterinary doctor if they think that's the person that can provide something that's interesting. So I think there's an opportunity for sort of a Renaissance view of this thing. The second thing to say about the dangers is that what we're seeing today is, of course, we've got, let me put it this way, we've got several, I would say, issues working against us. But maybe I should actually say first, my own view, and I think it's the view of my colleagues, is that the only way to have a strong, seriously strong journalism program that really relates to and improves journalism is it has to be a standalone program. I mean, it doesn't have to be only a journalism program. You would have PR and advertising and telecommunications in it. But when it's thrown into a College of Arts and Sciences, that's a recipe for disaster. It can't work. If you want to ask me why later, I can tell you. But there are several reasons why it never works out the way you want it to, in terms of a standard of being a high-quality journalism program. So what do we have going against us? Well, one is we have a problem of the media itself being in disarray, and so provosts who don't generally know what journalism is supposed to be anyway, or journalism education, wonder what journalism ought to be. For this exercise, we called up a number of provosts and asked them about their journalism programs and asked them if they had a master's program, and most of them didn't even know if they had one. And when you asked them about what a journalism program ought to be, they said, I don't really know, but let me say, they ought to be doing a better job than they're doing. They ought to be doing better research. And I don't find them being very creative and being very forward-looking. But the bottom line really was there wasn't a plan. Nobody showed me a plan of what we ought to be. Now, I'm painting with a broad brush because some of the schools, provosts we talked to had very good journalism programs and appreciated aspects of them. But the extent to which provosts did not understand what journalism ought to be or could not articulate what it ought to be was rather astonishing to me. And I think part of that, judging from those conversations and my own experience, is that they do not have, they look out at the media today and wonder what journalism really ought to be. It's not licensed. Anybody can do it, even more than in the past. And so you ask, what are the real standards? One of the things that we talked about in this when we were doing the report is that, you know, it used to be that if a provost didn't like, a provost's one optic into journalism was how bad the student newspaper was. And when the student newspaper did something bad, the president or the provost would call up and say, what the hell is going on in the newspaper? I had that happen when I was dean. But now, of course, they don't have to just look at the student newspaper to wonder how bad journalism is. And so that accentuates this, I think, this problem. The second problem is that, curiously enough, a number of the reports that have come out that talk about changes in journalism education can actually be used in a kind of jujitsu-like way against us. And a good example of this is what's happening at the University of Indiana, where it has one of our finer journalism schools in this country, which is now going to be folded back into a College of Arts and Sciences. One of the arguments that were given for doing this, one was that convergence, we have convergence, so therefore, you know, I guess if we have convergence between broadcast and print, we might as well converge sociology and journalism. As I said, it would be sort of like saying, since home economics has economics in it and economics has economics in it, I guess they ought to both be in the same department. But of course, that's really not true. And the third problem, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that point. And so the Carnegie reports that have been done were used by the provost there recently as a justification for why these changes should be made. They said, Carnegie report said that we need to do better journalism training. So obviously to get there, we need to put them back in the College of Arts and Sciences. And then third of all, we've put ourselves into a situation where we're providing standards that are very one-dimensional for journalism education. One of the other reasons that the provost at Indiana gave for changing the program, changing its reporting lines, was that they will do better in research rankings. The problem is the research rankings look only at scholarship in a very traditional way, in publications that are a very narrow publication list. That could be changed, and it should be changed, and I hope it will be, because if it's not, what will happen with those NRC rankings is that every time you go see a provost, if you don't score well on the rankings, and if the rankings are done in a very lopsided way, you're going to have trouble explaining how you're a good program, because provosts need some measure that they can use to decide if you're good or bad, and those external rankings become very important. So, where does that leave us? There's some good news in this. One of them is that we're not the only area of the academy that has concerns about being relevant. One of the areas I spend a lot of time paying attention to is international relations and foreign policy. And as a matter of fact, IR, as it's often called, is actually very concerned that they're not doing enough research that actually relates to and gives policymakers the information they really ought to have. The concern is that the research provides a lot of facts, but it doesn't provide any analysis or interpretation that you can use to make judgments. And interestingly, a survey that was recently done of IR, of practitioners, policymakers, was that they actually want to go to these documents and they want to look at them. And on the other hand, academics want to be players in this arena. But in order for them to do that, they're going to have to rethink how they reward high-quality research on a faculty. It doesn't mean low-quality research. It means high-quality research, but done in a way that has relevance. The second hopeful sign, I think, is that there are a lot of places on campus right now who are very concerned about what they're going to do in the future when the number of PhDs that they're turning out are superfluous. This occurs in the sciences and all kinds of places on campus. And one of the solutions is to turn out, even in sciences which have been either undergraduate or PhD oriented, to turn out more people who actually have a practical master's degree in areas like biology, for example. And I think schools like ours, journalism schools, have an opportunity to reach out across campus and make common cause with these kinds of programs and see how we can come up with standards for these programs that relate to what the university wants to do with programs that are at the heart of what the university does. It's always seemed to me that in the case of journalism, we had an extraordinary opportunity today because information has become so important. And rather than being at the fringe of the university, we ought to move to the center, where we'll be stronger, get more resources, and be able to do a better job for our students, as well as for society at large. I hope this report at least helps kind of encourage a debate on that point. And I guess the watchword, I think, for people in journalism schools ought to be sort of, I guess, Chancellor Bismarck. He wasn't a journalism chancellor. He wasn't a university chancellor. He's another chancellor who said, if this is to be a revolution, we should make it rather than suffer it. And I think that's how we ought to think in journalism education. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. And I'll just add a couple of quick comments before going to Charlie. Journalism education is, I think, more sort of out there as a discussed topic than it was 10 years ago when I first came here. I think that's partly because of things like the Carnegie at Night initiative, but it's also a lot because journalism itself, the world of practice, is in crisis. And so, you know, I'm being a little reductive here, but there used to be kind of a feeling of the industry has these great and eternal, we thought, institutions, and they'll kind of be the keepers of the good and true in the profession. The journalism schools will learn from them what those things are and will teach their students. And as the report demonstrates, thanks to the research that my colleagues did, from the very beginning, journalism education, for a number of reasons, has been unusual as a professional education field in the very heavy emphasis that the very heavy influence the industry had on the schools, which is more than in most fields. Now, people are saying, well, the mainstream organizations have been significantly weakened in many, many cases. There's a wonderful world of startups, but they're always understaffed and preoccupied with kind of growing to healthy maturity. And it's time for journalism schools to play a bigger role in the life of the profession. Now, that's great. I agree with that. That should be music to all of the ears of all of us who are journalism educators. Our concern with the way this conversation has unspooled over the last couple years is it tends to kind of go too much in the direction of journalism schools should be conceived of only in relation to what goes on in the world of professional practice and not conceived of as living in an inevitably delicate and uneasy equipoise between the world of practice and the world of the university, whose name is at the top of the paychecks we all receive, among other things. There's a tremendous temptation. Has anybody here seen an old movie called Broadcast News? So there's this wonderful scene in there where Holly Hunter, who plays a crackerjack producer, I don't know, it's like a 5-minute scene where she shows how she kind of jams a piece up on the air right at deadline. And there's this sort of wonderful exhilaration, and it captures better than just about anything I've seen the pure adrenaline rush and sense of craft that journalism in a professional organization by somebody really good kind of has and feels like. So it's natural to say, let's take that and bottle it and teach people how to do it in journalism school, and that's what journalism school should be. It makes sense, and why wouldn't that be the totality of what you did? And it is, as my colleagues have pointed out, deeply, deeply rooted in the history of journalism education to make journalism from within journalism schools. Virtually all journalism schools are heavily committed to doing that, plan to remain heavily committed, and are able to do it in a much more ambitious and rich way because of the advent of all the digital technology. So that's there to stay. And this kind of work is actually sort of trendy now throughout higher education, you know, applied learning, learn one, do one. So there we're kind of positioned to be leaders maybe in education. But going back to the Holly Hunter example, I don't know how long what Holly Hunter does in that movie is a marketable skill that you can live on. It was at the moment the movie was made. It may be, and the broadcasters will have to tell me. But what happens, you know, you're supposed to get professional education for life. What happens if that particular thing suddenly there's no demand for, and that's what you've been trained to do? So for journalism schools, there's frankly, a political issue that we're always going to be behind the 8 ball to some extent if we're resistant to universities and university culture and orient ourselves only toward the practice world and not at all toward the university, because the university is where we live. But it's more than just a political issue. I think it's a substantive issue. Great professional education should figure out how to prepare you to practice the profession, but also equip you with things you can't get out there in the world of professional practice, but that would serve you well in the world of professional practice. At this moment, nobody in a newsroom, or precious few, can teach you how to write code, for example. We can teach you how to write code. And there's a list of things journalism schools can teach pretty easily, if we're doing our job right, that newsrooms can't teach but want. So at this moment, when we have a chance to be leaders in journalism more, I think the non-obvious but powerfully true point is the way to get there is to think not just about the practice world, but also about the university world and how to leverage that. Of all professional schools deal with these issues, most professional schools are having the opposite struggle of the one that we're having. They're overwhelmingly oriented away from the profession and are under pressure to become more oriented toward the profession. We tend to be overwhelmingly oriented toward the profession, and at least in our view, could come back a couple notches toward the university in some ways that we suggest toward the end of the report. We're not trying to be super prescriptive, but we do give a menu of sort of thematics around how a journalism program should be conceived of. Let me make just a couple more quick points before I stop. One, why are master's programs so important when they're so numerically small? Couple of things. One, it goes back to what Jack said. If you have a strong master's program, if you're at a school that has a very small master's program, and actually in our report there's this kind of alarming chart that the number of accredited master's programs in journalism has dropped by 50% during the life of the Carnegie Knight Initiative because of schools deciding to not accredit their programs. If you have a strong, healthy, powerful master's program, it's a much better way to make a case for being a freestanding school. If you're basically offering undergraduate majors, it's much harder to fight these inevitable arguments of let's just make you one of a bunch of majors, which has a number of unfortunate consequences or potential consequences that we outline there. Another thing, to get a little bit technical, as those who are in the biz in the US know, undergraduate programs, you have to take about 2/3 of your credits outside the journalism school. And journalism schools have to have very small class sizes. And what that does is it kind of forces a lot of what's taught in journalism programs into very expensive to offer, very good, but very expensive and resource-gobbling small form skills classes. And it takes away a lot of the oxygen for journalism schools to develop other broader capabilities sometimes. If you're a master's program, the gravamen is on you to deliver all the credits to the degree yourselves. And that's a good discipline in making you think about not just skills, but how to master complex subjects, how to contextualize yourself as a professional, et cetera. Final thing is just I want to end on a point of uncertainty that we never quite figured out, and maybe in the subsequent discussion we can wrestle with a little bit. I am genuinely confused about, in an ideal future, what a journalism professor's life cycle should look like. And I think of that as an unanswered question. At many schools, including this one, X% of the faculty are accomplished journalists who somewhere in, late, early, whatever, depending on what people want to own up to, middle age, leave the newsroom and go to the university and teach and write and so on. And then the rest of the faculty are career academics who have always been scholars of the media. And often, though it could never happen here at Columbia, these two groups fight with each other, and that fight is a characteristic of the life of the school. It would be nice if there could be developed a more coherent and unified career path for people who become journalism faculty. For example, it's very, very rare, although it happens occasionally, for somebody to, as happens with, say, law professors, graduate as an outstanding student at the school and really spend almost all of their career as an educator in the profession. We tend not to do that. Maybe we should find a way to do that. I do think we need to find a way to take these two very culturally separate groups that tend to exist on most faculties and give each a bigger element of the other so that they'll understand each other more and be less at loggerheads. So I'll leave that as a sort of unanswered question. Charlie, thank you for, as we say in New York, schlepping all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to be here. And for agreeing to be our first responder. So take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. And it is a real pleasure to be in New York on such a beautiful day, and also a real honor to be alongside such eminent journalism educators who have contributed so much already, but also have written what I think is a very fine report, a very beautifully written report as well. And I find myself somewhat in quite a lot of agreement. I like Jean's point, for example, about the idea that journalism education should be partly about having the capacity to anticipate change. And I thought that a lot of what Jack said about strategic vision, the idea of trying to reconcile being serious and yet being relevant, and that idea of somehow putting journalism at the center of the university, I thought were very, very good ideas. I'm in a slightly precarious position in the sense that I'm jet lagged, and this is a very high stool. But
did you drink on the plane?
No, that's right. I rested last night. But as I say, I find myself in agreement. And once again, I find myself not a little envious of both the kind of capacity of American journalism education, and I should say there are at least a couple of my British colleagues here who also do a fine job. But there's a lot more of J School in the States, and also envious of the history of journalism education in the States as well, partly outlined it in this report. And I should say at this point that I am an ex-journalist. I went to the LSE to set up a journalism think tank, and I'm now a professor and head of the Department of Media and Communications, but I do not run a J School. So if you like, that's the precarious position that I have no real authority to speak to this, but I'm going to anyway. The other funny thing, of course, is that, and I said this to Steve this morning, that you're celebrating 100 years of Columbia's journalism school. My department is celebrating 10 years of being a department. So for once, the Brits can't even pull rank on history. Two things I want to start with, though, which is the kind of big questions, which is journalism is changing, so shouldn't we be much more challenging at this moment in journalism education about the very idea of journalism? And the other big question I want to raise is that if we do want to go deeper into the university, shouldn't we question more what that actually means? I think that what lurks behind this is the danger that we give the impression that we're training for a priesthood at the very moment when a lot of people's faith is very much in doubt. And in a practical sense, I think this does actually, that aura can put very talented people off who would otherwise be very interested in journalism education. I also think that it increases the tendency towards a lack of editorial and intellectual diversity. And I think in that sense we should be admitting heretics, not acolytes. So what's the problem? If there is a crisis in journalism, and I'd define it much more as a critical phase rather than a point of destruction, then I suspect, well, that might be more about corporate strategies than journalism education. I think we are in one of those phases where the industry is responding extraordinarily in many innovative ways, but it may not always be the best judge of what it needs next. So I think we have to ask ourselves in journalism education whether we're any better. I think Jack's idea about strategic vision is important there. And of course, it's important to remember that we're not just here, as people have said, to supply an industry. And who knows what that industry is anymore? It's moved from being a manufacturing industry to a service industry, and it's one that now finds itself combining a kind of highly competitive knowledge economy with an equally brutal market in networked social relationships. And of course, it's not just one industry anymore. Journalism's intimately engaged with a much wider media sector that itself has been redistributed. Journalism, as people keep saying, now happens everywhere. So it's not possible to prepare graduates for that without much more open terms of intellectual reference. In that sense, I'd say that knowing about journalism should inform any other human activity. That should be our ambition. So what do we need to know? Well, I agree with the report, for example, that understanding versus skills, that understanding versus skills debate, that feels incredibly redundant now. Because if nothing else, the new technology has helped to, in a sense, remove that dichotomy. Production is now so much more integrated and accessible that, if you like William Blake, all journalists and journalism academics can be both philosophers or poets, as well as craftsmen and publishers. But before we leave the craft behind, I want to say that I am assuming that everyone in this room, everyone buys into a very radical and thorough implementation of what Emily and her colleagues called post-industrial digital journalism, multi-skilling, entrepreneurship, the rest of it. And I think that the Carnegie Knight projects have been exemplary on the kind of thought leadership there. But there does have to be this sense of strategic purpose. What's it all for? In a sense, I think this is not just the big vision, but it's got to be ingrained in everything that journalism does, and therefore when you're thinking about it in journalism education. And I'd call this the snowfall problem. Yes, we absolutely need radical new narrative techniques and skills, but we need to ask what difference it can make to better understanding or better journalism when we have those techniques. What changes, for example, between the audience and the source when we use live blogging, for example? What ethical difference does it make? Does it change the balance of power, for example, between the producer and the consumer and the subject? So I agree that new forms and structures of journalism can make a difference, but we pay very little attention to this beyond, what works or what is groovy, or alternatively, is this journalism? So I think we can be much better informed by the insights of other disciplines or other expertise when we start thinking about this kind of understanding. It's partly about learning to know much more about different things, such as, quite often tedious and complex things like science and finance. But of course, if that's all that you that's not all that you necessarily need. 'Cause if that's all it is, then in that sense, you're just getting a varied education. I think more important is an understanding of how knowledge narratives are framed, how agendas are set, not just by journalism, but within those other areas of life and information and study. So yes, we absolutely must orientate towards the university, but not exclusively to journalism, of course, or even just to media studies. There must be a greater interaction with thought leadership and theory in other areas, such as sociology and economics, as well as our more traditional neighbours in law and politics. And I think Jack referred to this as that the idea of the university is itself being very much questioned. And this might actually be good news for journalism studies, because I think it is an opportunity to connect journalism, higher education, graduate studies into this shifting academic landscape. And again, in the States, you've got a head start on this. The interdisciplinarity is something you're relatively familiar with. But it shouldn't just be narrowly comparative. We shouldn't just look at another discipline to try and fit it into ours. That's a very facile way. Take climate change, for example. We, in journalism studies, do a lot of research into media coverage of climate change. But do we ever combine with scientists, for example, to look at the research, if you like, on the ontology of climate change? If you like, the Rumsfeld problem. What can we as journalists or scientists know about the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns, whatever they were, of a subject like climate change? Because I think it's interesting, why are we always behind the curve when as topical people in universities, we should be aware of what's next? And I think part of the problem is around the idea of diversity. And I mean this in a much broader sense than just background, although background is part of it. And one of the problems we've got is that the professionalisation of journalism and indeed journalism studies means that it's increasingly drawing from an ever-narrowing group of people, narrow in the sense not just sociologically, but I would argue intellectually. And this really matters because in relation to the editorial diversity in journalism, we are quite clear, isn't it, that we need to find new sources, new platforms, new structures, new storytelling techniques, new ideas, new ways of finding relevance for journalism to match the diversity of audiences and the increasing variety of ways that they're connecting content between creators and consumers. In a sense, I'll argue that this is the business model problem. How do you find new ways to add real value to journalism? And in that sense, I think it's an existential problem for journalism studies too. Just think about it. I thought this up on the plane, so it's probably wrong, but none of the great news media inventions of the last decade came out of a J school. Everything from Twitter to Vice. None of it. Now instead, the better J school graduate schools produce people who want to create more versions of the BBC or the New York Times. Now that is changing, but it's a challenge, I think, to our academic as well as our kind of vocational credibility. So, to sum up, you'd be grateful to hear, I've got no problem at all with J schools that want to teach craft and skills. It's absolutely essential that that's part of the mix. And I agree we need to head back to find value in the universities in which we work. But I think we need to be much more exciting and excited by change and the intellectual challenge it offers to connect journalism to the wider university and to the wider world. And I thought your example of international relations is a really good one. That's a classic area where journalism could have so much more to say and might actually strengthen that discipline as well. That way, we might find that the intellectual talents who want to raise our standards, who want to innovate intellectually, and above all, hold university power to account. Just last thought, I mean, who was the most effective journalist of the last decade, last 5 years? The most effective in terms of the impact ratio for their resource? Well, I've got a publishing interest in this, but I would nominate Mr. Assange. Would he have got into Columbia or the LSE, I should say? I mean, I could also say, would I have got into Columbia or the LSE? The answer is no. But would Julian have got in? And I think it's pretty clear that he wouldn't have done. I like to think that in the world that we're talking about, he might, if he had got in, he might actually have been a better journalist, though I suspect and fear that the combination of attitudes we have might have stopped him from doing what he did. Of course, we can disagree about whether that would be a good outcome or not, but I think it's the significance of Assange and what he represents that matters. And what did we have to say in journalism studies about that? Did we turn to our usual sort of cupboard of pieties, or did we have the intellectual reference point for a stimulating debate? Discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk back and forth. I want to sort of prime the pump by calling on a couple people, but be thinking of questions or comments you want to make. These two gentlemen sitting here, George Brock and Richard Sambrook, are copiously quoted in the report, so I think they get a right of reply. Both have gone from being high-ranking journalists in news organizations, actually before they were middle-aged, to high-ranking positions in British journalism education, George at City University, Richard at the University of Cardiff. So do you all have a response to any of what we've been talking about? Or?
Thanks, Nick. Can I just say a couple of things? When I joined Cardiff University, so I switched into the academy a year ago, and in my first week went to a staff dinner, and on my right was a young academic, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm searching for the gravitational waves given off by the Big Bang because it's going to reveal the 95% of the universe we know nothing about." And on my left I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm the Nobel Prize winner for Cardiff's work on the Human Genome Project." And when they both said, "What do I do?" I felt that saying I train journalists was not really going to keep the end up for the journalism school within the context of Cardiff University.
So you lied?
I did, as Jack would thank me, I did my best to say that we're living in the age where information is more important than ever, and making all those arguments as well as I could. But I think the point is that unlike most disciplines in universities, where actually the kind of high-level research informs industry, leads to real innovation, leads those disciplines in all sorts of ways. Journalism, certainly in the UK, doesn't do that. And in fact, most of the industry and most of the journalism schools, and I include Cardiff, so on, in spite of the good work they do, wouldn't think of themselves or define themselves in that way. And I agree that I think the way through that is to elevate journalism education, but it has to be done in a very open way, and there are a lot of barriers to it. Cultural, financial, and structural barriers.
George?
I think my role here is to be a little ray of sunshine. I think that the problem of isolated, defensive, craft-based journalism education is disappearing very rapidly because the existential crisis in journalism is so big that you can't discuss, teach, train people for journalism, whatever vocabulary you're using, without thinking about first principles. That problem really is solving itself. I genuinely think it is. However, there is always going to be a tension between craft practice and thinking about what it is. you can only manage that tension. You can't make it go away. I would say that I think the aspect you don't quite address in your report is the problem about the measurement of what is research. The problem I face, and it's partly specific to Britain, is that universities, having had their financing system radically changed, are competing with each other on a completely new basis. And the research currencies are very rigid. Citations, peer review, all of this kind of stuff. And that makes research about innovation in particular, which is really the heart and soul of what this thought leadership should be about in J schools, I think, quite hard to do. Because you're trying to look forward, you're trying to speculate, you're not studying something 5 years back and waiting 18 months for it to be published. So one just has to be ingenious to get around these problems. But I'll just give you one example of how we've done it. One of the ways in which we try to get around the university, trying to shackle us into classic academic patterns, which are not always totally helpful to thinking about journalism, is we try and host people who are doing different things. We have a thing called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is hosted in the university buildings, which is based on the ProPublica idea. But our most recent arrival is a site called The Conversation. It began in Australia, it's now started in Britain, it's going to be started in America, and I think in India in the spring. And The Conversation is a site with an interesting business model. Universities subscribe to it. Editors put up about 6 or 10 pieces every day, usually short, few hundred words, mostly written by academics. Sometimes they summarize research, and sometimes they comment on topical things that are just going on in the news, because they're things they know about. This is a small infant editorial team perched, quite literally, on the roof of our university building at the moment. I don't know whether it's necessarily going to work. There are many, many experiments in online journalism that are going to fail, although it looks pretty robust to me. It isn't strictly research. It is journalism, probably a piece of the future. It's not quite research, it's not quite craft. It's how we mix the two.
Thanks. And I should say, in the report and in real life, journalism schools so far have been, in the US, have been able to hedge their bets to some extent by defining research as traditional scholarly communications research and history, the kind of thing that Michael and Andy and Todd Gitlin do, what I would call exemplary journalism, nonfiction books and documentary films and so on, which many of us do. And then the new kid on the block for us, but something the report very strongly urges people to get into, is more applied research, the kind of thing several people have mentioned, where we would hope in a generation the answer to the question, why haven't significant advances in journalism sprung from research conducted at journalism schools, the answer would be, but they have. And Knight's been very generous in funding some of that, and we're doing that here somewhat newly now. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Joel?
3 quick ones. One, in answer to your question, I would not say Julian Assange, I would say Nate Silver. Secondly,
Nate would say Julian.
yeah.
That's right.
Secondly, one of the conclusions I saw was that you were looking for a more standardized faculty member and you want some level master's degree. Well, that would preclude you not only from being dean, but from being a
That's
faculty
true.
member. And without I can't imagine Columbia, you not having led that for 10 years, so I think you might want to rethink that part of it. But the third thing I think is the mix and match of this, because you're talking about the future of journalism education, journalism schools. But in fact, there aren't that many journalism schools left anymore. And even journalism schools aren't journalism schools.
Right.
And they're communication schools.
Right.
And we have 11 professional master's programs. 3.5 of those are journalism. The rest are public relations or advertising or documentary film and history. And so I think when we're looking at research and you're looking at all this, I think you can't just say journalism because, 95% of the internet is public relations right And we're still teaching these people, and PR is exploding because where our profession has been diminished, corporations and government have made up for it by hiring more people to write stuff, to do all that stuff. So I think we might be too narrowly focused here when the future is kind of in all these.
Yeah, I guess on that one, the Carnegie Night initiative began with a trumpet blare that we're really just talking about journalism here, even knowing that that's a minority of what most of the Carnegie Night schools do. So we're sort of continuing that tradition. We're not pretending that there isn't all this other stuff, but this is sort of it's something at the end of an effort that was just about the journalism part. Lorraine? Right.
It does complicate the
Yeah,
conversation
yeah.
also when you try to just stay with journalism, because most of the schools, as you say, are combinations of different varieties of kinds of communication. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of times journalists feel like they're, and Nick uses this term in the book, that they're the truth-seeking people and the other people are not. My view on communication and thinking about communication is that there is a lot to learn from how politicians use communication, how public relations people have used communication, a lot of understanding about the audience and about impact that journalists kind of shunned and didn't want to deal with for a long time. So embracing some of that kind of research for journalists, I think, could actually advance journalism. It doesn't mean that it's not just, some people tell the truth and some people don't. It's a really terribly simplistic look at things. I had a college newspaper advisor when I edited a magazine for a mental health organization, told me I had gone to the dark side and would not speak to me ever again. So I think those days need to go away, and we need to benefit from the knowledge that we have across the boards.
I saw one other hand up, and I'm getting the sign that we're getting near the end, but come on in.
Just a couple of observations and then a question. Charlie, I think it's right to say that in the last 10 years, innovations that have come out of that have related to journalism, Twitter, Wine, the examples that we gave, kind of not journalism, but mostly platforms. I think it's right to blame or say that journalism schools haven't been the source of that. They don't have newsrooms, neither have media companies. These are all come from technology, so I think the blame ought to be spread a little wider. John, it was an interesting point about, at the end you said that journalism schools need to move to the center of universities and become more core. Having graduated from Indiana University and Unified School of Journalism, you could argue that what is happening there now is actually in some ways making that journalism program a little bit more central, because I've seen the school really struggle with outdated infrastructure, a building that is kind of falling apart, not enough money. And maybe one of the answers is to put it as part of a larger school to see that its future is in slightly better hands. And we could talk about whether that will ensure that will happen or not. So just having graduated from that school, just a counter observation to this argument that it should be independent.
Should I respond to that?
Sure.
Or do you have another point to make?
Yeah, I have a question actually. It was really encouraging to hear Jean talk about the fact that maybe we should have anticipated some of the trouble that the news business has gotten into, and part of our job as faculty is to kind of teach our students to anticipate where the industry is going. Where I'm having trouble seeing a connection is that having run newsrooms before being in the News Corp, I was managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. Before that, I was managing editor of the Washington Post. In about 15 years of doing this, I can count on my single hand the number of professors who have written to me saying, can we come and spend some time in the newsroom? I don't see journalism faculty actually wanting to come and spend time in the newsrooms at all. On the board of ICFJ, we're trying to work with ICFJ at night to kind of see if we can come up with a back-to-school program for faculty. So I'm curious about your thoughts about how can you make that happen, because how can you teach students to anticipate the future when you're so disconnected, by and large, there are exceptions, and what's happening in newsrooms around the country or around the world.
Can I just make a quick point about that? I know we're over time, but we're going to end up soon. This is an experience I had over the summer that was striking, and Kate's heard me make this point, but nobody else has. So I'm back to being a journalist. So I was writing a story about the Securities and Exchange Commission for the New Yorker. And I'd go around and talk to law professors, and every law professor who essentially, as we would say in journalism, covers the SEC, A, they know everything that's going on there, and B, they know everybody at every school who works on the SEC. There's this very rich disciplinary life. Because of the career pattern that practice-side journalism faculty tend to follow, typically journalism faculty only work in one university in their whole life. And even an event like this, you know, even if we had a completely boring and useless discussion, which I don't think we're having, just to have a sense of gathering of people in the field and talking about issues in the field is a value that I think we need in this field. I think that the schools tend to be very self-enclosed. Faculty don't know their colleagues at other leading schools, and I agree with what you said. They're also not in and out of newsrooms all the time as they should be. And these are things that need to be aspirations for us, more than aspirations.
Let me just, not because I want to fight over Indiana, I mean, I can think of lots of reasons to move the program into the center of the university, but one of them would not be if I wanted to be a good journalism program. The reasons when I made the comment to move toward the center of the university, I meant part of what Nick was just saying, that you make sure you're involved on the campus in all the ways you need to be involved so you're credible. What happens in a lot of journalism programs, and I understand we're looking at that in a very sort of one-dimensional way, but is that they look around and say, all these academics, they have PhDs, they don't know what the hell's going on. They don't want to participate in those parts of the university, and by cutting themselves off and by not playing, they end up not being able to build the lines of communication they need to defend their programs. Journalism schools have to defend their programs. That's just a fact. You know, it's interesting, as we all know, or many of us know, Colorado is just, they've axed their program. They would never axe the English department. That's not going to happen. No matter how dysfunctional they were, no matter how bad they were, they're not getting rid of them. But that doesn't apply to journalism. But here are the other reasons why you don't want to do it. Journalism schools, unlike, say, English department and ceramics, have a much better opportunity to raise money. And as soon as you are in a college of arts and sciences, what happens is the dean takes the money from you, counts the money you get from fundraising and gives it to other units. That's a fact, and that's what happened at your alma mater. The reason they got out of arts and sciences was that they were impoverished because they were the way the political structure worked was their money was siphoned off. The second problem is when you're being ranked by people who are historians. My PhD so happens to be in diplomatic history. If you're a historian or in the English department, they have a metric to rank whether you're a good faculty member. And that metric, has nothing to do with the professional skills that we need in our programs. So it becomes very difficult, for example, to hire a serious journalist. When I was dean, I hired a guy, he was an editor of 7, his team won 7 Pulitzers. I had to fight like hell to get him on the graduate faculty. One of the things I did when I was provost is I made sure that was easier to get done. But there's the problem. So I understand why, I'm a big proponent that the faculties need to move to the center, but they don't do it by becoming something other than what they are. They do it by reaching out and working constructively with other people on campus, not by becoming like the English department.
I think I just want to throw in, there are a couple of exceptions, I think, to that. I think the program at Wisconsin, for example, is an excellent journalism program, but it's had difficulty raising money and the salaries have been low, and it's had those kinds of issues. And I agree with Jack that it's a lot easier to raise money if you either have an arrangement so that, when I was at GW, we were in arts and sciences, but I had an arrangement by which if I raised money, I kept it. And that's not the usual pattern. You don't usually have a dedicated person helping you fundraise, a dedicated development person. And that becomes a huge issue for advancement.
Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk about what I do as some kind of model, but in a way, it responds to what you said and what you said, which is I do spend a lot of time in newsrooms, actually, and it's seen as very strange, especially when you're head of department, that you spend all that time with real folk. But the reason I do it is that is kind of how I do my research, even though I'm not formally researching. But I'm also within a media and communications department, so we don't do PR, although whisper it quietly, but I'd quite like to. But we do a whole series of other things. And then, of course, I spend, because I'm a journalist, it's like a kind of intellectual playground being at the LSE, with all, hundreds of really clever people from all around the world. So I spend all my time zooming off to do other things. Last week I spent an afternoon with, we call it the government department, politics people, looking at the mediatisation of government with a bunch of senior civil servants, really interesting. And then the next day with a sociologist talking about memory and mourning after the death of Princess Diana, which immediately got me thinking about archive and journalism's role in people's lives. All of these things, with respect to J schools, told me new things about how journalism can be relevant and interesting and add value. It made me respond as a journalist to being in those situations in a way that, frankly, I don't get off by simply being with other journalism scholars, especially as has been said, if they're having to do that often tiresome and redundant thing of 3-year-old, peer-reviewed journal copies, articles so they can keep their post and claim to be a researcher. And at the same time, we try and bring journalists in, not on beautifully funded 3-month scholarships, because then they just really want to leave the newsroom, but enlightening kind of people spend a few weeks with us and then they go back to their place of work. So I'm not suggesting this is some kind of model. It's happened by accident as much as by design. Although interestingly, the person who lay behind the reason that I'm in the LSE is Anthony Giddens, who, eminent sociologist who saw that media and journalism in particular should somehow be there in the DNA of any effective university.
Now, we're seriously over time. Several people have caught my eye. 1, 2, 3. So can you 4? So can I give you like 2 minutes each and then call it a night? Because I was supposed to get everybody out of here at 6:15. So Top, you go first.
Well, I had a quick look at the report today on the internet, and I listened to the discussion. And there's been considerable comment about credentials of instructors, of faculty, and so on. But I find no reference to what kind of students would we be looking for. Will there be any change in admission standards? If some bright person comes to you and simply says, what I want is basic know-how for a job, would you admit that person and re-educate them?
I don't want to answer now. I mean, I would answer yes, but that's a thing that should be in the discussion that follows on the report, and you're right that we should have more about that in there.
I have a question about curricula that are very ethnocentric in an increasingly globalized world. Should there be more focus on the teaching of languages so that our journalists can function in a better way and understand the world out there?
In a graduate program, time is your enemy. In most master's programs are a year. It's really hard to make a market around 2 years. And it's the difference between what you'd like to do and what you have time to do.
I'd like to see that problem solved at the general university level so that there are wider requirements for all undergraduates in language. I think that we are language poor in this country, and we need to address that at much earlier stages than a master's program.
Lorraine?
2 quick things. My name is Lorraine Brand. I'm the dean at the Newhouse School. When we first started this process, I said early on that I really thought the focus should have been on undergraduate journalism education, not graduate journalism education, because that's where most of the people who are entering the field are coming from, and that's where most of the programs are, and those are the programs I think that need help and need to be changed. But I'm actually very optimistic about the future of journalism education. I think we're at a very important time in the history of journalism, because for once, we have an opportunity to lead instead of follow. The industry is in disarray. They don't know where they're going or what to do. And if we're smart, and if we're strategic, and if we focus on things that are important, and I think research is one of those, and not just theoretical research, but very much applied research. And putting together, I think what you mentioned, Nick, about this dichotomy between the scholars and the practitioners in journalism schools, we have to find a way to get past that. And we should be bringing those people together, because the scholars can help those people who are practitioners. Together, I think, we can figure out some things, and we can create things in journalism. And I was disappointed in some of your recommendations that you weren't talking about some of those cutting-edge skills that journalism of tomorrow needs, some of the innovative things we need to be focusing on. We hired a professor to focus on journalism and innovation. We hired somebody to focus on entrepreneurship. We hired somebody to focus on teaching social media, because these are the skills of the future, and trying to figure out how to take those things and integrate that into, as you pointed out, that one-year program that is already full of so many things is a challenge for us. But I think it's a challenge that we are well equipped to take on if we really think about what we need to be doing.
Last word.
Okay, so bridging on from that, one of my favorite things from the research that came out was the lovely chi-squares versus green eye shades debate. And I just a caveat that I consider myself very fortunate. I have the two best journalism traditions. I was an undergraduate at Missouri School of Journalism, and Dean Jean and Anne Rex, I'm going to be a social scientist at UNC. And I can say, despite as much as we want to think, there is a lot of friction in between those two disciplines. So I'm just curious if when you were talking to the provosts, or as you do your exploration, if there are examples on how we can better blend those. It is a matter of just asking research questions that the practical folks in the newsroom can provide data to answer. Is it bringing Dr. Wright in to explain how content analysis can be used in a newsroom? Are there things going on now that point to a better integration of adding to the literature and of working in the real world?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but we're so far over time, I'm going to tell you later what they are.
I just want to answer one thing about that quickly, though. I have seen really good results come from pairing faculty, getting a good research person and a good journalist together, talking about what questions they want answers to and how to get there.
So last thing I'll say is, I hope this is obvious to most people in the room. This title is an homage to the late Professor James W. Carey of this school and others, who was one of the great figures in journalism, education, and communication research. He was the president of our disciplinary association in 1978 and gave a speech called A Plea for the University Tradition. So we're giving him, he's no longer with us, but we're giving him a shout out in this report. And I hope he'd be pleased by that. Thanks for coming, everybody. And this has been a terrific discussion, and any loose end, arguing point, et cetera, should be taken as a spur to keep the discussion going, which is what we want to do here. Thanks. Okay, that's what I want to shoot.
Well, I don't know. However you do it. Tell me. It's a problem.
Did she leave? No, but she's still there. Okay.
Sur le discours réel.
How are you? My son. You also did a great thing. You said in a very gentle way, you pointed out which I
How are you?
Very interesting.
Yeah.